Live from Quito, Ecuador, I'm Sunny Gray, and this is From the South, the evening news brief from Telesur English. We start this new edition right now. The high-level donor conference held by CARICOM and the United Nations on Tuesday raised over $1.3 billion in pledges and just over $1 billion in loans and debt relief for the Caribbean countries that were severely hit by hurricanes this year. One by one, the leaders of the devastated islands stood up and explained how precarious the situation is after Hurricanes Maria and Irma. Almost all said the international estimates of the cost of the damage were inaccurate, and that the true cost either matched or exceeded their annual expenditure or even their GDP, making reconstruction impossible without international help. With essential industries like tourism ravaged by the storms, in the words of Dominican Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit, the spread of the damage does not permit early bounce back. Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arias told the UN CARICOM meeting that his government had decided to write off Dominica's entire debt to Petrocaribe, which stands at over $100 million.
Es por ello que traigo instrucciones del presidente Nicolás Maduro.
I have been asked by President Nicolás Maduro to formally announce in this meeting a solidarity action towards our brothers in Dominica, similar to the decision made by President Hugo Chavez after the Haiti earthquake. Today we want to announce that because of the difficult situation the people of Dominica are facing after Hurricane Maria, Venezuela has decided to write off Dominica's debt with Petrocaribe from the date it was acquired to September 2017, totaling more than $100 million. This will allow the government and Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit to have funds to rebuild this country, as well as for the creation of a fiscal program to access new lines of credit.
Que permita acceder a nuevos créditos.
With just 4 days to go before the presidential elections in Honduras, another activist has been murdered. El Heraldo newspaper reports that the body of Jose Maria Discuya, a member of the Opposition Alliance Party, was found on Wednesday morning in the center of the country with blows to his head. His body has been taken to the capital for post-mortem. 2 other opposition activists have been murdered in Honduras in the last 2 days. They are Elcia Portello of the Liberal Party and Jose Gonzalo Castillo, a leader of the Libre Party. The authorities haven't determined yet who carried out the killings or why. The murders occurred in spite of the heavy security implemented to protect voters and the electoral material ahead of Sunday's poll. More than 18,000 ballot boxes have been distributed to voting centers across Honduras, according to the electoral authorities. 50 ballot boxes have also been sent to the United States, where around 51,000 Hondurans are registered to vote. And as Hondurans prepare to go to the polls, the government of Juan Orlando Hernandez is still being questioned over corruption cases, including those related to the bankruptcy of public institutions. We have more in this report.
One of the most emblematic corruption cases in the current government is the embezzlement from the Honduran Institute of Social Security of over $300 million. Some people say it cost the lives of some 2,000 people. Even though Juan Orlando Hernandez admitted using part of the money for his 2013 campaign, no one was punished for this crime.
I think this administration has no moral right to talk about fighting corruption. This administration admitted they pillaged the Social Security to finance their campaign. And with such cynicism that when people asked for an impunity commission in Honduras, they said they would create an integrated system to fight corruption.
Hernandez's government is also linked to irregular contracts, such as the ones for main roads where now citizens have to pay a toll. The Coalition Against Impunity is demanding an investigation.
The contract for national roads in the country was decided, granted, and is currently operating, especially for the so-called tourist corridor. where the payment of tolls was made obligatory for all people who want to drive on these roads.
For many critics of the Hernandez government, corruption has reached unimaginable levels. The excessive control of state institutions allows a concentration of power and limits the application of justice.
We really are in a political situation in which we've practically lost all institutionality. There's no balance of powers in Honduras. There's a concentration of presidential power in the hands of the President of the Republic.
For others, the biggest act of corruption by this government is the standing for re-election. This is constitutionally forbidden, but has been justified by a modification of a secondary law that set the penalties for this crime, even though such a reform should only come through a constituent assembly.
In the unlikely case that he wins the election, this will be an illegitimate government. It is an illegitimate government that results from a coup against the judiciary when they sideline the Constitutional Court in order to allow re-election. That's when the judicial coup took place.
According to the country's Anti-Corruption Council, Honduras is losing around $450 million every year because of the situation.
The North Korean Foreign Minister Ri Yong-ho has met his Cuban counterpart Bruno Rodriguez in Havana in the hope of revamping international support amid widespread condemnation of Pyongyang's nuclear missile tests. The Cuban Foreign Minister said that his country wants to see peace and stability on the Korean peninsula. Cuba and North Korea have maintained warm political relations since 1960, despite Havana's often stated opposition to nuclear weapons. And we have more news in a minute, so stay with us. Thousands have marched in Santa Cruz to support a change in the Constitution that would allow the re-election of President Evo Morales for a fourth term. On December 3rd, Bolivians will vote for judges who can approve a change in the 2009 Constitution, allowing Morales to run for another 5-year term. But the opposition are pushing hard for a no vote, saying that the move would be unconstitutional.
We are supporting our president, Evo Morales. We'll continue working for 5 or 10 years. The only thing the opposition do is question the politics of our country. The opposition doesn't have any proposals, any ideas, nothing. Our president has a plan for 2020 to 2025, and he will fulfill all the projects that he has been developing.
Several social organizations in Paraguay are worried about the general state budget approved by Congress. They're asking for more resources, especially for the National University of Asunción and public health. Workers from the health and education sectors are demanding congressmen increase the budget so they can receive work benefits that have been postponed. The Congress approved a budget of $13 billion after lawmakers made a few changes to the budget proposed by the executive. Our correspondent in Asunción, Osvaldo Zayas, sent this report.
I'm standing in front of Congress where the general state budget is being debated for 2018. Several student organizations are protesting against the budget cuts that could affect the National University of Asunción. The Minister of Finance, Lea Jimenez, has said that they are thinking of taxing public university education, although student leaders denounced this proposal, saying that the government has the intention of privatizing the National University of Asunción. Civil servants, health workers, and public school teachers are also protesting along with the students to demand that the budget for their areas not to be cut. They are also protesting against the neoliberal policies of the government of Horacio Cartes, which are not benefiting the majority of the population.
In Argentina, social and political organizations have taken to the streets to protest proposed labor and pension reforms put forward by President Mauricio Macri's right-wing government. Our correspondent Edgardo Esteban files this report.
We are standing outside Congress, where various social movements and political organizations, as well as recyclers, the Tupac Amaru small and medium farmers have gathered in various demonstrations around the Argentinian capital. The protest rejects any debate over the labor reform law. They are also questioning a pension and tax reform that will be deliberated in Congress over the coming hours, following the initiatives put forth by Mauricio Macri's right-wing government. Widespread disapproval is becoming more apparent on the streets of Argentina, but much more so here outside Congress, where people are rejecting Macri's proposed distribution of wealth. If the pension reform law is implemented, retirees and pensioners would lose over $6 billion from their holdings, money which would move to the more powerful sectors. Throughout the streets of Buenos Aires, you can see the indignation of the people reflected in protests, such as the one we find ourselves in now.
Ricardo Esteban with that report. The search for the missing Argentine submarine has reached a critical phase as the Navy is worried about the oxygen levels inside the submarine. The rescue effort for the missing Argentine submarine enters its 6th day without any trace of the vessel. The Navy says if the submarine is unable to rise to the surface, it would be using its last oxygen supply. There has been growing anxiety amongst the family members of the missing crew over the uncertainty of the vessel, but some family members remain hopeful.
We came to provide support. We have hope, faith that they all will come back. Yes, we have to have hope that they will come back.
Hundreds of people in Bogota have protested to demand that the government implement the peace agreement signed with the FARC. Protesters rallied on social media to organize the action, in which hundreds of people gathered in Bolivar Square outside the Justice Palace and banged pans for hours. Demonstrators are demanding implementation of the peace accord to put an end to ongoing delays and continued violence across the country.
We are worried that this traditional political class could continue to take us to war, and apparently it seems that this is what they want.
I am a woman worried about the safety of my children and grandchildren. That is the reason why I'm here today, to defend the peace agreement that was signed in Havana.
Brazil's lower house is still discussing a proposed constitutional amendment, which, if approved, could prohibit abortion for any cause. Even for those already approved by the law, for Brazilian women, this would be a major setback to their rights.
The climate was tense during the debate in the commission that's analysing the constitutional amendment proposal 181. The principal document that lengthens the maternity leave period for mothers of premature babies was already approved, but it can still be modified. If that law is approved, abortion would be forbidden in any situation.
A law like this pulls Brazil away from having a basic understanding and concern for its minorities, with the excluded ones, because abortion is already illegal. It's already criminalized, and yet it is still performed. We frequently see women going to hospitals, to the general health system, after they had abortions done, not because they want, but because of the circumstances in life.
It's very common that abortions are performed by married Christian women who have a stable life. But unfortunately, those who don't have the resources for a safe abortion in Brazil suffer the consequences of badly performed ones, like being left barren or dead. These are mostly black women, poor women from the outsides of cities. To strengthen the laws towards abortion in Brazil is the same as condemning even more women to death.
The digital platform of Us has gathered over 160,000 signatures against the banning of abortion in Brazil.
In Brazil, women die daily after an abortion. So are these women well represented here in the chamber? Are these women being heard today? We don't believe so. That's why we're bringing this petition.
Deputy Erica Coquet from the Workers' Party warned about the severity of the approval of this constitutional amendment.
They want to include in the Constitution the inviolability of life since conception, something that contradicts what's already established in the Penal Code. They also want to include that designation in an immutable clause. And what is an immutable clause? Something that can only be altered by a new constitution.
In Brazil, 135 women are victims of sexual assault every day. If the constitutional amendment 181 proposal gets approved, not even they will have the possibility of a safe abortion.
We'll be back very soon, so stay with us. The Lebanese Prime Minister Saad al-Hariri has suspended his resignation 2 weeks after he announced he quit the government. The announcement will ease the crisis which has deepened the tensions around the Middle East and will also offer a brief respite for the Lebanese who are struggling with the spillover from the war in Syria and a large refugee population. Lebanon is already rife with sectarian divisions. Hariri reiterates that Lebanon should disassociate from external struggles and regional conflicts. A key summit attended by Russia's Vladimir Putin, Iran's Hassan Rouhani, and Turkey's Recep Tayyip Erdogan is underway in Russia to increase efforts to end Syrian conflict. The leaders aim to reboot the peace process in war-torn Syria. The meeting comes 2 days after the Russian leader hosted surprise talks with the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Putin has been exploring a diplomatic solution to the Syrian crisis and an end to military action.
In our common opinion, the successes on the battlefield that are bringing closer deliberation from militants throughout Syria also open a qualitatively new state in crisis settlement as a whole. I have in mind the real prospect of long-term comprehensive normalization in Syria, the political arrangement of the country in the post-conflict period. This is where our joint statement is aimed at as a result of these talks.
The United States' threat to close the offices of the PLO in Washington has led to a sharp reaction from Palestinians. Our correspondent in Gaza, Noor Harazin, has the story.
The Palestinian leadership on Tuesday suspended all meetings with the U.S. officials at various levels after the White House threatened to close the office of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, in the United States, unless Palestinians were involved in real peace talks with Israel. In a sudden move last week, the U.S. State Department rejected to renew the operating license for the PLO's office in Washington. A rare provision in the U.S. law in 2015 allowed the shutter of the PLO's office if Palestinians acted against Israel at the International Criminal Court (ICC). The State Department believes that President Abbas went afoul of the law in September when he called on the ICC to prosecute Israeli officials for war crimes against Palestinians.
The non-renewal of the operating license of the PLO office in Washington, which hosted the signing of the Oslo Peace Accord between the PLO and Israel, terminates the U.S. role as a mediator in the peace process. This decision is completely denounced and rejected.
The legal provision allows the U.S. Secretary of State to renew the PLO's operating permit in the U.S. Capitol every 6 months, after making sure that its mission has complied with conditions posed by Congress. In 1994, President Bill Clinton allowed the PLO, the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, to open an office in Washington. Noor Harazin, Telesu TV, Gaza.
Now let's take a look at some of the top stories from around the world.
President-in-waiting Emerson Mnangagwa has returned to Harare ahead of Friday's swearing-in ceremony and giving his first public address. The former vice president visited South Africa, leader Jacob Zuma en route to Zimbabwe, following a week in exile after Robert Mugabe fired him to make room for his wife, Grace, to succeed him, sparking a military intervention. Mnangagwa, popularly known as a crocodile, said that Zimbabwe is witnessing the beginning of a new and unfolding democracy for the country.
No one is more important than the other. We are all Zimbabweans. We want to grow our economy. We want peace in our country. We want jobs in our country. We need also the cooperation of our neighbors in SADC. We need the cooperation of the continent of Africa. We need the cooperation of our friends outside the continent. That we shall achieve. I am already receiving messages of cooperation and support for us to grow our economy.
The general known as the Butcher of Bosnia has been charged with war crimes in a historic trial for the country. Residents have been reacting to the verdict, which found ex-Bosnian Serb army chief Ratko Mladic guilty of genocide and ethnic cleansing 20 years ago.
At the end of the day, the joint criminal enterprise, genocide, and all the bad things that have happened during those years in Bosnia and Herzegovina is not just the issue of Ratko Mladic. There are many more war criminals who haven't been caught by justice yet. They haven't been tried, and unfortunately they probably never will be, not even arrested, let alone put on trial.
An Israeli ex-soldier and spokesman for Breaking the Silence agreed the document's alleged abuses of Palestinians has sparked a legal battle with the Israeli authorities by saying he himself beat a detainee. The former army lieutenant openly said he had beaten Palestinian stone thrower in the West Bank town of Hebron while trying to handcuff him in 2014. However, the Justice Ministry last week declared the case closed. A verdict celebrated by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who called the group liars and slanderers on his Twitter account.
What we're after is describing what a 50-year occupation looks like. That's what Breaking the Silence is about. When Dean gave his testimony to us, that was what he was after. We're not against prosecutions or investigations. We're definitely against politicized prosecutions and investigations, and that's exactly what happened in this case.
Leading Palestinian political factions have agreed on the need to hold elections by the end of 2018. They said in a joint statement issued after 2 days of reconciliation talks in Cairo. Britain has slashed its growth forecast and expects to borrow a lot more money post-Brexit, according to a new preliminary announcement.
Pay, Mr. Speaker, is now lower than it was in 2010, and wages are now falling again. Economic growth in the first 3 quarters of this year is the lowest since 2009 and the slowest of the major economies in the G7. It's a record of failure with a forecast of more to come. Economic growth has been revised down, productivity growth has been revised down, business investment revised down, people's wages and living standards revised down. What sort of strong economy is that? What sort of fit for the future is that?
In Spain, repression against activists defending their right to a proper home is intensifying. We have more from Madrid.
In the Parla judge houses near Madrid on November 21st, a veteran activist against evictions, Ricardo Rosado, was sentenced to 6 months in prison for threats, damages and violence.
Nothing really happened. It was a peaceful protest where we were trying along with the residents from the Estrella Avenue to fix an electrical fault. That was used as an excuse for people to leave the old Ivima building, and that building was sold to Goldman and Sachs.
The victims' organization warned about an increase of criticism against their members, as they believed that the threats would intend to damage the reputation of the union.
Right now, there are people in the movement who are totally targeted. One of them is Ricardo. That every time they take to the streets to try to avoid a prohibition of a human right, such as the right to a house, they get an administrative sanction or a criminal prosecution, sometimes with sentence to prison.
This time, the case has been shelved and Ricardo was released, but this doesn't always happen. Isabel, who is 51 years old and a mother of 2 children, was recently sentenced to 6 months in prison and a €6,000 fine. It is money she can't afford because she's unemployed and without social security. She was accused of an alleged attack on the police who arrested her. This footage proves that she was protesting peacefully.
They got me violently. I was telling them be careful with my back, and I was identified after a while, after having my arms and legs tied and almost without being able to breathe because I was surrounded by police.
Isabel was trying to prevent this eviction from taking place against a man who lost his home because of a scammer who is now in jail.
It's very dangerous because they are supposed to give us security and protect our well-being, but instead they are favoring scammers, favoring banks, and disregarding our human rights.
Regardless of the repression, all activists warn they will keep their fight for the constitutional right of a home. This week, they will try to stop at least 11 evictions.
It is just over 5 months since the Grenfell Tower block burned down in West London. It was Britain's deadliest fire in more than a century, and the survivors are still struggling to recover. Last Thursday, the Metropolitan Police released the official figure of the dead as 71, and this Wednesday, Britain's Finance Minister has promised $37 million for mental health services for the former residents. Many of these are immigrants, and the fire revealed the stark social divide in that part of London. Residents have complained that the government has been slow to provide them with aid because they'd rather see them move out of the fashionable area. Earlier, we spoke to Toying Agbetu from the Grenfell Media Watch. We asked him about the Finance Minister's offer of $37 million for mental health services and if it would be of any help for the affected community.
Actual mental health services problems are actually caused by the government and caused by the council by so much of the ineffectiveness of what they've been doing. So as opposed to actually alleviating the trauma, what they're actually doing by leaving people in hotel rooms, leaving them in bed and breakfasts, continuously seeing them every week with no progress, is that they're actually exacerbating the problem. So yes, 28 million may seem like it's a great amount, or $37 million might seem a lot, but when you think that Kensington and Chelsea Council sits on a reserve of some £217 million, they've had the finances to solve this issue. What the government should be focusing on is actually making all the other tower blocks across the UK fire safe. That's the issue. Dealing with Grenfell is a much more complex issue rather than chucking, which in the scale of this particular situation is actually a small amount of money.
And with that, we've come to the end of this evening's news brief. For these and many other stories, you can find them on our website, telesiotv.net/English. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. For Telesio English, I am Sony Gray. Thank you so much for watching.